Is President Xi Jinping steering China off a cliff? The CCP and the world at a crossroads. China's rapid economic ascendance has allowed the country and its president, Xi Jinping, to hold a place on the world stage. China has the second largest economy in the world, second only to the United States. In addition to the economic rivalry with the U.S., under Xi Jinping's direction, China has undertaken a program to create what they call a world-class military to challenge the United States and the world order. The Chinese government has assumed an aggressive foreign policy stance to match its military and economic ambitions on the world stage. The Chinese, with their open talk of taking control of Taiwan, by force if necessary, and warning all other countries not to interfere, it can be determined that 2023 was the most aggressive year yet for China since the Korean War. It seems like it will be much of the same in 2024, but beside the confident bravado of Chinese leadership, there are some serious headwinds in China that may create major setbacks for China's ambitious international plans. China is currently on a prolonged state of deflation in their economy, with the rate of price decreases accelerating at their fastest rate in 14 years. The reason for the deflation has multiple reasons, including slow recovery from COVID-19, high government debt, persistently high youth unemployment, a real estate bubble, government interference in the stock market, and depressed consumer demand because of all these economic headwinds threaten an economic spiral. Part of the reason for unemployment and low optimism is due to the West attempting to decouple or at least diversify from China. This contributes to the high unemployment, which results in both reduced domestic and international demand, as factories and ports have slacked demand due to the West's decision. The decoupling initiative is partly China's fault, as they tried to leverage their ability to produce cheap products and hold near monopolies in commodities to hold against countries that angered the CCP, which forced much of the world to seek diversification and alternate sources outside of China. Another issue with the leadership of President Xi Jinping himself, as he is early into his third term, which is unusual for China. The later half of Xi's rule has been more repressive than his first half. This includes the, quote, zero, end quote, COVID policy and its brutal enforcement, the repression of the Uyghurs and the assimilation of the Tibetan population, the repression of freedoms in Hong Kong, the use of the counter-espionage laws against foreign businesses, and the tightening of restrictions on civil society through such measures as the social credit score system. All of these measures have further depressed the Chinese population and has further impacted domestic sentiment that results in reduced domestic demand, which feeds the deflationary cycle. President Xi has further attempted to assert control in the economy by rolling back free enterprise in the country and by placing more regulation and oversight on private businesses and promoting state-run enterprises over private enterprises. Xi's repressive tendencies work against spurring domestic demand, as his actions erode consumer confidence and frighten international business investment. All these headwinds, largely due to President Xi's policies or reactions to events such as COVID-19, is at a time that China is becoming more bellicose in the world. China's threats have created a reaction by the world, who at first was willing to accept Chinese behavior in exchange for all the cheap goods that China's factories offered, which increased corporate profits. This started to turn around under President Donald Trump, who used tariffs to punish China to change its unfair access to market practices against the U.S. President Joe Biden ended many of the tariffs against China, but has also pursued a policy of appeasing China on trade and seeking cooperation on green environment initiatives, but also attempting to foster cooperation in the Western Pacific to form loose military coalition to challenge China. This effort is largely led by Japan, the Philippines, Australia, and South Korea, working closely with the U.S. NATO countries and European Union have also taken notice of China and have followed the U.S. in fostering cooperation in the Pacific and to tighten trade controls in addition to their own decoupling from China, as they see the economic and military threats in the Pacific could impact the Europeans' economic security. The late half of 2023 saw some positive changes as economic headwinds in China has led to the CCP to soften its rhetoric against the West and Japan as it attempts to dissuade the countries from decoupling from China. However, China in nearly the same breath threatens any country that tries to build relations with Taiwan or pledge support in the event of a Chinese invasion, and threaten the world they would regret decoupling from China. Many assume China's threat is to flood the market with cheap goods and cripple industrial output of its rivals. President Xi has also committed to China creating a world-class military by 2049 to challenge and defeat the United States. So China softens some of its rhetoric and has offered some olive branches, but for the most part has not fundamentally changed its policies. The bad economy and the effects of a spiraling deflation has put financial pressure on China, but more concerningly to the CCP, it threatens to create social unrest. China has experienced increased criticism of Xi from its citizens who are becoming more vocal and out in the open with that being more vocal. The question for President Xi, does he continue down this course of increased control and repression that will only exacerbate the economic issues but advance his goal of taking Taiwan and challenging the United States militarily? The risk of this course is that further destabilize the CCP's control over the population and ultimately threaten its authoritarian rule. Or does Xi relax control over the economy and try to spur economic growth by seeking better relations with the West and Japan and its neighbors in the South China Sea, and domestically easing repression and allow the return of market incentives? The danger for the West and its regional allies is if it keeps up pressure that the CCP may reach a state of desperation and use a war against the United States and Japan, most likely over Taiwan, in the hope that a war will rally nationalistic fervor in the population against China's enemies, thus delaying the social unrest that would come about with a continued sagging national economy. Dictators desperate to hold power rarely give it up easily, so the West needs to be aware of irrational actions from the CCP to maintain power regardless of the cost. The disruptive escalations and provocations in the South China Sea, the threatened invasion of Taiwan, and threats of the country not to have relations with Taiwan, including threat to intercept the U.S. Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi's plane en route to Taiwan. The threats of retaliation of price dumping if the world decouples from China, and assisting drug and arms smuggling across the U.S. border with Mexico, it is abundantly clear that China is not a good actor on the world stage and should not be trusted as an honest broker of any agreement. The question for the world to ask is, does the headwinds in China force a domestic and international course change for Xi and China, or will China double down on their totalitarian escalation and risk the world turning against China at a high cost to an economy that is struggling and all the societal destabilization it risks in China? The West and Asia-Pacific allies should not give in to China's threats and should continue the course of decoupling, but should find ways to constructively engage China to reform. This is easier said than done, but diffusing the world's reliance on China while at the same time creating conditions inside China that promote reform, erode the power of the CCP, but not directly threaten it so much that it becomes desperate enough to hold on to power at all costs. 2024 is a crossroads for the world and China that are full of promise to promote reform and dial back its ambitions, or it could be the world closer to a conflict in the Pacific.